Whether the assurance of acting from a conviction of duty is true, whether what is done is actually a duty, these questions or doubts have no meaning when addressed to conscience. To ask whether the assurance is true would presuppose that the inner intention is different from the one put forward. That is, that what the individual self wills can be separated from duty, from the will of the universal and pure consciousness. The latter would be put into words, but the former would be strictly the true motive of the action. But this distinction between the universal consciousness and the individual self is just what has been superseded, and the supersession of it is conscience. The self's immediate knowing that it is certain of itself is law and duty. Its intention through being its own intention is what is right. All that is required is that it should know this and should state its conviction that its knowing and willing are right. The declaration of this assurance in itself rids the form of its particularity. It thereby acknowledges the necessary universality of the self. In calling itself conscience, it calls itself pure knowledge of itself and pure abstract willing. That is, it calls itself a universal knowing and willing which recognizes and acknowledges others, is the same for them. For they are just this pure self-knowing and willing, and which for that reason is also recognized and acknowledged by them. In the will of the self that is certain of itself, in this knowledge that the self is essential being, lies the essence of what is right. Therefore, whoever says he acts in such and such a way from conscience speaks the truth, for his conscience is the self that knows and wills. But it is essential that he should say so, for this self must be at the same time the universal self. It is not universal in the content of the act, for this, on account of its specificity, is intrinsically an indifferent affair. It is in the form of the act that the universality lies. It is this form which is to be established as actual. It is the self which as such is actual in language, which declares itself to be the truth, and just by so doing acknowledges all other selves and is acknowledged by them. In paragraph 654, we see Hegel continuing to develop for us what conscience is and how it works. And we've brought in language in some of the earlier paragraphs. It's always been there since it's the medium by which we've been carrying out all of this, along with thought and action in the world and all these other things. Language is going to be only discussed at certain points within Hegel's phenomenology, but it's really inescapable. And so when it comes to the fore, we really do want to pay attention to it. And in this paragraph, not explicitly but implicitly, we see something going on within Hegel that's going to prefigure some of the great insights about language in 20th century thinkers, but framed in Hegel's own terminology and in light of what he's particularly interested in. So, what's happening here? We're setting up conscience, which is now claiming to be universal knowing and willing. This entire morality section, we began from the individual after freedom and the terror, being this person in whom the totality of every value could reside. It's a big claim. That can't really rest on anybody's shoulders once it starts weighing on them. And what we're going to see here in this section, when we read it carefully, is that all the things that, from this point of view in the phenomenology, and it's not the point of view of spirit, itself or of Hegel, but rather of conscience as a particular mode of self-consciousness, right? Self-consciousness in relation to others. What we're seeing is that its viewpoint on itself is ultimately going to be unsustainable. To go back to an earlier section, conscience itself is engaging in dissimulation or deception, but deception of itself and deception of others. So what is going on? Let's take a look at the text itself. He says, whether the assurance of acting from a conviction, an Überzeugung, right, being convinced of duty is true, or whether what is done is actually a duty, these questions or doubts have no meaning when addressed to conscience. Now, have no meaning. Well, when we say that something is nonsense or meaningless or has no significance, sometimes what we mean by that is that it's literally, undecipherable. If I just say, and we'll use an interesting example here, blah, 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 right? And we think about that linguistically, what is that? That is an expression that we use to mean meaningless, unimportant, superficial, repetitive, diction, writing, whatever somebody is doing. So, that's more blah, 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 right? We're dismissing it. But now notice, if you were to go somewhere else and you're talking with non-English speakers and you were to say, well, that's, in their language, blah, 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 they might look at you strangely and wonder, what's this repetition that's going on? Does this mean something? Is this significative? What is a blah? What would be the importance of saying it 3 times in a row? It is culturally conditioned, right? Even nonsense, what counts as nonsense, what gets signified as nonsense, is not quite so simple as pure meaninglessness or valuelessness. So to say that this is without any significance or meaningless for duty, these questions, or not for duty, but rather for conscience as a shape of consciousness, yes, it's that conscience doesn't want to deal with these things and dismisses them, but they actually are quite important. These are the things that have preoccupied us throughout trying to figure out what duties actually are and what action in accordance with duty is. So they're not totally unimportant. He says these questions or doubts, doubting, is what I'm doing actually the right thing? Is it my moral duty, my obligation? Or am I indulging myself in satisfying my own desires and inclinations and calling it duty? As Kant pointed out to us, very often action in accordance with duty has a secret spring of self-love concealed within it, right? So am I actually following my duty? Is my conviction, my being convinced, my being convicted, the way that Protestant Christians these days use that term, of duty true? Or am I, let's take a few examples, am I acting out of some sort of internalized guilt that came to me from my parents or from culture or something like that? I mean, this is Freud's notion of the superego, and I don't think you have to take on all of Freud in order to see that conception has actually got something behind it. People do internalize not just the moral norms of their culture or society or family or whatever it happens to be. They also sort of internalize that voice of those people saying, you should do this, you're a bad boy, you must not do this, dirty child, all those sorts of things. Maybe my conviction of duty is coming from that. Or maybe my conviction of duty is coming from the wish to be viewed as a good person when I'm really not a good person. Or we could come up with all sorts of other examples as well. Maybe I am, a new person in the era that we inhabit, where people come up with new platforms that are going to revolutionize education, revolutionize the workplace. I'm talking about online platforms, right? Revolutionize this. We're going to change it. The whole world is going to be different. And it's going to be better. I could say, well, that's my duty to bring forth this software platform that makes everything better. But I might just be telling myself a whole bunch of lies about whether it's my duty or not, and whether the thing that I'm bringing forth is actually good, and whether it represents what's best in humanity. So this question of truth is an important one. Conscience, here's the real important part of this. Conscience doesn't want to consider those things. He says to ask whether the assurance is true would presuppose, so these are the things that are being presupposed, that the inner intention is different from the one put forward. So, that there's a disjunction there. And conscience doesn't want there to be any sort of disjunction. We've had plenty of that in all the other shapes and forms and dialectics of moral life or ethical life that we've been looking at so far. Conscience wants to be the place where we're beyond that. We don't have to ask that. We know that we're on the right track. We know that we're the good person. Our inner intention matches up with the intention put forward. Absicht, right? Two different Absichts. Literally what you're aiming at. How often, let's take a pause before we go further into the Hegel thing. How often have we been convinced that we, as good people who know what the right thing to do is and are choosing to do the right thing, how often have we discovered within ourselves a little bit of a split, a little bit of a disjunction between our public face, what we're saying about that, and what we really are inside, the inner intention. Hegel goes on, and he tells us that this intention put forward is, in fact, the duty, right? And the inner intention is what the individual self wills. So what is duty? The will of the universal and pure consciousness. Now, we've had this disjunction running throughout this entire section, and indeed throughout the phenomenology, this splitting between what I, as an empirical, existing, actual, Wirkliche in German, individual, want, need, demand, put forth, intend, and what my better self, the more universal self, the self that is also abstract, the self that only truly exists through the individual self, what that self would want, intend. That's the good self that has the duty. Then we've got the, whatever we want to call it, the empirical, the not so good self that chooses what it chooses. So in conscience, this has been dealt with. He says, this distinction, now notice he doesn't say disjunction or a conflict. This distinction, even being able to say these are different from each other, this is really important. This distinction between the universal consciousness and the individual self is just what has been superseded, aufgehoben in German, right? We should remind ourselves very briefly about what this means. This is a key term for Hegel. The dialectic proceeds by aufheben, by things being aufgehoben, which means that in some respect they're left behind, but what's important of them has been brought in and integrated, at least to some degree. So this whole disjunction has not just been annulled, it's not just been left behind altogether, it has been superseded. And Hegel says the supersession of this is conscience. This Aufheben is Gewissen. So he tells us that the self's immediate knowing that it is certain of itself is law and duty. Notice, immediate, right? So the self, knowing that it is certain of itself, is law and duty. Now, when you hear it framed like that, you probably ought to say to yourself, whoa, that is one big claim. Now, is Hegel making that claim? Hegel's saying that's what conscience itself thinks about itself. And that's what you might call it, cultural representatives at that given time in the historical development, and what we can find of that also in the present, because these dialectics replicate themselves into our own present, into our own culture. That is what they tell themselves. But that's a big claim, right? The very fact that you are certain of yourself and you know that to be the case is law and duty. And we could say, duty for what? And that's a great question, because any particular duty is not going to be duty as such in this case, right? He goes on and he says, its intention, through being its own intention, is what is right. All that's required is that it should know this and should state its conviction that its knowing and willing are right. And so this is part of what the supersession or Aufheben of conscience consists in. Knowing and saying. The German is sagen, right? Das es sage. And so what does it know? It knows that its intention is right. And you can say, well, how does it know that? Couldn't it be wrong? Well, we've left those doubts behind. That's why it's so dangerous. Right? We're not doubting that anymore. We're not even asking that question anymore. We know our intention is right. And then here's where we get to the most interesting part of this paragraph for me. I mentioned all these remarks about language just a little bit earlier. It can't just know that it's right. It can't just act in that knowing. It has to externalize that in language. It has to say that. It has to assert that. And that means that it's got to say it not just to itself, but to somebody else. It's got to make its point clear, right? And you've known people like this, people of conscience, who they behave in a certain way, and sometimes you say, oh yeah, the person of conscience, their conscience was properly formed, they really did the right thing. Great example, Martin Luther King, not a perfect individual, but you read the letter from a Birmingham jail and you look at his actions, and you're like, well, he's driven by conscience as well as principle, and he's doing the right thing. And those who are criticizing him, they're kind of off base here, and his conscience is what allows him to do the thing. But the action, although, King says that action by itself is communicative, and he's right about that. He also writes a letter. He also gives speeches. He also engages in saying, right? And we know many other people who aren't Martin Luther Kings who would love to think of themselves that way, or even who appropriate Martin Luther King and sort of take all the radical elements out of his thought and turn him into a let's all be nice to each other sort of BS kind of caricature, in order so that their conscience can be assuaged and they can know that their intention is right. And then they also blather on endlessly about how great their intention is. And we're like, yeah, you're a fraud. We see through your BS. But they don't see through their BS. Or maybe there are little cracks through which it shows, and those insecurities lead them to assert all the more, these questions have no significance for my conscience. I have no doubts. Lots of doubtless people, at least with their public face, who are off base when it comes to morality, when it comes to political organization, when it comes to how we ought to live together and what we ought to value and prioritize as human beings. This is what is so dangerous about conscience, right? So it says that its knowing and willing are right. It declares this to itself and to others. He says the declaration of this assurance in itself rids the form of its particularity. It thereby acknowledges the necessary universality of the self. This is a universality that it's asserting, that it's trying to, latch onto, but in many cases, as we're going to see, it doesn't really have. And so in calling itself conscience, Gewissen, it calls itself pure knowledge of itself and pure abstract willing. So here's where we have the stuff I've written above here. It calls itself a universal knowing, a Wissen, and willing, Wollen, right, which recognizes and acknowledges others. This is a very important thing to point out. Recognizes and acknowledges others, plural, right? Das die anderen anerkannt. So recognizes and acknowledges, a little bit of a pleonasm there. Miller is translating anerkennt, anerkennen as both recognition and acknowledgement. Perfectly fine. This is the thing that self-consciousness is desiring. And in this case, it is telling itself that it is giving this to others. It's also looking for it from others at the same time. This is why people can get so upset when they say, I'm acting on conscience. I will take my stand here. And you're like, you're full of crap, buddy. You're just self-serving. You're in the grips of some ideology. You're a partisan. You're not for some sort of universal humanity. You're for your particular class, your particular group, your particular cronies, your particular race, whatever it is that they are doing and claiming that it's universal conscience. They get very upset when you say that. Why? Because they're not as secure as you would expect. They're not getting the recognition or acknowledgement that they think they are thereby earning by giving it to others. So he goes on and he says, it thinks it's the same as them, for they are just this pure self-knowing and willing, and which for that reason is also recognized and acknowledged by them. In the will of the self that is certain of itself, in this knowledge that the self is essential being, lies the essence of what is right. Now, again, we should remind ourselves, this is what conscience, this shape of consciousness, is telling itself. We should actually ask, is the knowledge, the wissen that it has, the knowing, really, truly knowledge? Or is it kind of pseudo-knowledge? So he says, therefore, whoever says he acts in such and such a way from conscience speaks the truth. For his conscience is the self that knows and wills, right? Speaks the truth that they're convinced of, at least, not the truth in the absolute sense. And he says, it's essential that he should say so. We come back again to the function of language and expression. Why? For this self must be at the same time the universal self. Notice what he says next. It is not universal in the content of the act, insofar as it does something, and then, that is communicative. It displays the values that the person has. That's still particular. It has to talk about itself and its actions and its conviction in such a way that everybody else could hop on board and say, yeah, man, I'm just like this person over here. I'm like Martin Luther King. Or I'm like Martin Luther, his namesake, right? The one who says, I must stand here. Or I'm like this person or this person or this person. That's what language allows us to do. We move away from the content of the act to the form of the act in that case, where he says that universality lies. And he says this form is to be established as actual. Where can it be established as actual? Language. He says, it is the self which, as such, is actual where? In language, which declares itself to be the truth, and just by doing so acknowledges all other selves and is acknowledged by them. So, what we have here sounds really, really great, right? In language, it's doing this universal action, which is conscience, leaving behind any doubts or qualms or concerns. We know we're doing the right thing. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, man, there's a lot of different things packed in here, and you're saying that they're all basically unified and integrated. I don't know that that's really the case. And language is one of the places where these things can start separating out from each other, and the doubts that we're having can actually come to light. Conscience, then, in the majesty of its elevation above specific law and every content of duty, puts whatever content it pleases into its knowing and willing. It is the moral genius which knows the inner voice of what it immediately knows to be a divine voice, and since in knowing this it has an equally immediate knowledge of existence, it is the divine creative power which in its notion possesses the spontaneity of life. Equally, it is in its own self-divine worship, for its action is the contemplation of its own divinity. Paragraph 655 is another one of these very short paragraphs where it turns out that there's quite a bit going on, particularly if we read between the lines, as we have to do with Hegel's reference to moral genius, right? Which is kind of an interesting term. We'll talk about why in just a moment. But let's look at the vocabulary and the text that he's using here. It's really quite, in some respects, over the top, right? And that should be signaling something to you. But let's look first at the text. So he says, conscience, then, in the majesty of its elevation above specific law and every content of duty, puts whatever content it pleases into its knowing and willing. So there's a lot going on there. What is it? Well, we have conscience, and conscience is now at this point in the majesty. This is where he's bringing in some royal language. Conscience in the majesty of its elevation above what? Specific law, particular things, and content of duty, particular duties. So the person of conscience, remember, conscience isn't some sort of thing floating out there. Conscience is embodied in actual human beings who, at this stage of consciousness, present themselves as being, in some respect, better than the people who came before them, and perhaps better than all the other people who are still at earlier stages or dialectics of consciousness, those who are still earnest about actual duties. This person can look at them and say, oh, it's so sad that you still think that you have to be bound by these laws and duties that are coming to you from without. This is me sort of legislating for all humankind. It's sort of a dark side to Kant's kingdom of ends. This person who subsumes that to themselves and then crowns themselves king or queen. So conscience is going to set aside any specific law or content of duty, not just because it interferes with what conscience decides it wants to do, but sort of in principle. Nobody can tell me what to do. And we do see people like this every once in a while who are like, you don't know me. And actually, in some respect, we can say, yeah, of course I don't know you. I don't know every single thing about you, but I do know your type. They're the type of person to say that I am somehow above everybody else, and what I think is right, I have decided. I may not even have any knowledge. It may be a gut feeling. It may be whatever it is that I'm relying upon. And people like that often do quite terrible things to those, especially who are close to them or depending on them. So conscience, of course, they may be good people too. They may be doing all sorts of wonderful things. This is kind of a dangerous way to do it, though. Conscience, he says, puts whatever content it pleases into its knowing and willing. And its knowing and willing is what in the previous paragraph, and the paragraphs before it, we were saying is this sort of universality. Now, it also ties in not just willing and knowing, but it's going to also lead to action, Handel, right? The behavior. And as we saw in the previous paragraph, it's also going to lead to speaking or expressing itself, communicating about its knowing and willing. It's got to blather to everybody about what a great knowing and willing it's got, how its knowing and willing are the best, infallible even. So, I think by this point you may have recognized some people that you know. If you don't know anybody like this, either you're living a blessed existence or you might be that person. So that's part of what's going on in that very first sentence. Now here's where we get to something really interesting. Hegel says, it is the moral genius which knows the inner voice of what it immediately knows to be a divine voice. So let's pause for a moment on this moral genius. Moralische Genialität, right? Genius. Okay, so in the Romantic period, genius is a really good term. We still use it today to describe people that we think are really smart and, or gifted in some other way. We can talk about a musical genius, and we can talk about somebody being a genius of innovation. Usually claims to genius are BS. You probe close enough, you look closely enough at that person, and it's not just, coming out of some inexplicable or unknowable void that happens to be within them, which turns out to be full of all sorts of things that none of us could see. No, I mean, you actually look into the lives of people that we consider to be genius, and you can figure out a lot of how they came up with their conclusions. And oftentimes they'll actually tell you in books that they write, and that's great, right? But the Romantic period did... And actually, I mean, this goes all the way back to Kant and then comes through German idealism as well. You know, when it comes to aesthetic matters, they thought that genius was actually, a legitimate category, quite important. And, Hegel certainly talks about that in his discussions of aesthetics. What about a moral genius? Well, this is where it gets interesting. And, Hegel is not a Kantian in the sense of like following, in lockstep. There's a lot of Kant in all this morality section and some other previous sections, but Hegel, is trying to go beyond Kant as well. But Kant is crystal clear that anything that's about the moral realm should be universally explicable. It's based on concepts. It's based on notions that we can compare with each other. It's not like the aesthetic, where, in fact, when it comes to beauty, Kant says in the Third Critique, well, it's different than the moral stuff. The good makes kind of a universal demand on us, and we can explain it to others. What I find beautiful is not based on concepts in that way, and I can certainly try to make an argument why you should see it as beautiful, but you might not. And ultimately, we may be very different from each other. And when it comes to like production, well, the genius is going to be somebody who knows how to line things up properly and do the right thing in that respect to produce the beautiful or the sublime or produce whatever it is that they're going to produce, right? Does it work that way with morality? No. One sign that you've got morality wrong is that you think it's unique to you, or only people like you can actually get it. If that's the case, you're actually probably immoral from the perspective of that. A moral genius is kind of a weird bird, right? Because to say that somebody has genius elevates them above all the rest of us and says we can't really understand what's going on with them. But they can tell us what's good, what we ought to do. Now, this goes back to my own Army days. I remember when I was in basic training, we had this guy, he was one of the drill sergeants, Sergeant Huff, and he would use the word hero in a very sarcastic and derogatory way, and you could tell by the tone of his voice when he was talking to recruits. He would say, "Hey, hero!" He had kind of a weird twang that I can't capture. And the contempt was just dripping through that. You're not a hero. You're actually some schmuck who's, under me and is not even remotely close to a good soldier at this time, right? But he was calling you a hero to drive home to you the fact that you're not a hero. You're not anything. Imagine something like that tone here in Hegel's voice as you're reading this when he talks about moral genius. Because I think that's what puts it into proper perspective. And it just gets thicker as we go on, right? So the moral genius knows the inner voice of what it immediately knows to be a divine voice. Fortunately for itself, it's its voice, right? Its voice as divine. Since in knowing this, it has an equally immediate knowledge of existence, it is the divine creative power which in its notion possesses the spontaneity of life. Whatever it decides to put into willing, knowing, acting, and speaking, that is the voice of genius, that is the voice of God, and everyone else should listen to it, and this person is so fortunate to be a channel of the divinity. And he says, equally, it is in its own self divine worship, for its action is the contemplation of its own divinity. When it acts, it looks at its action, and it's like, and the Lord said that it was good, or whatever we want to frame it as, right? It registers its own action as so wonderful. Hegel is not putting this forth because he believes in any of this. He's putting this forth as this is where conscience is going to go as a shape of consciousness. And when we read this, we should be like, oh, this is a burn, and things are going to go topsy-turvy real quick.